You don't speak unless I ask you to. The sentence didn't just land. It cut through the air like a line no one dared cross. And for a moment, even the soft jazz drifting across the rooftop restaurant seemed to hesitate, as if the music itself was deciding whether to keep playing. Ethan Caldwell didn't raise his voice often. He didn't have to. At 38, worth just over $2.7 billion according to every major business magazine in the country, his presence alone usually did the work. Tailored navy suit, silver cufflinks, posture sharp enough to slice glass. He was the kind of man who walked into a room and quietly rewrote its rules. Tonight, that room was perched 30 floors above downtown Manhattan, wrapped in glass and gold, where the skyline blinked like a living thing, and every table carried conversations worth more than most people's annual salaries. The dinner wasn't just a meal. It was a negotiation disguised as elegance, a $600 million biotech partnership hanging delicately between crystal glasses and polite smiles. And somewhere between the third course and a poorly timed interruption, Ethan decided someone had stepped out of line. Naomi Brooks hadn't meant to interrupt anything. She moved the way she always did, quiet, precise, almost invisible, the kind of presence that made guests forget she was there until they needed something. 26 years old, working double shifts 6 days a week, she had mastered the art of not being noticed, not because she lacked presence, but because she understood something most people in that room never would. Invisibility could be protection. Her uniform was spotless, her hair pulled back neatly, her posture straight but never stiff. To the guests, she was part of the background, another server navigating trays of wine and plates of food. But Naomi wasn't just moving, she was listening. Every word, every tone, every slip. And in a room full of people who believed power made them untouchable, listening was a dangerous advantage. It started small. A glass placed slightly off-center. A question asked at the wrong moment. Or maybe it was nothing at all, just the wrong person standing too close when Ethan Caldwell wanted control. He turned, his jaw tightening just enough to signal irritation before the words followed. You don't speak unless I ask you to. Heads turned, not dramatically, but enough. A subtle shift, forks pausing midair, conversations lowering just a fraction. The kind of silence that doesn't announce itself, but settles quietly, like something waiting. Naomi didn't respond. Not right away. She held the tray steady in her hands, fingers relaxed, eyes calm. To anyone watching, she looked exactly how they expected her to look, composed, obedient, unshaken. But inside, something moved. Not anger, not fear, something sharper. Recognition. Because this wasn't new. Not the tone, not the assumption, not the way people like Ethan spoke as if authority gave them ownership over other people's voices. Across the table, investors exchanged brief glances, careful not to linger. No one wanted to interrupt. No one wanted to be the one who challenged the man controlling the deal. Ethan adjusted his cufflink, dismissing the moment as quickly as he created it, already turning back to the conversation as if nothing had happened. As I was saying, he continued smoothly, his voice returning to that polished, measured rhythm that had closed deals across continents. Timing is everything in this market. Naomi stepped back, just half a step, enough to return to the edges of the room where she was expected to exist. But she didn't leave. She stayed within earshot, moving slowly between tables, refilling glasses, clearing plates, her presence blending seamlessly into the environment. And all the while, she listened. Numbers, names, timelines, a detail here, a contradiction there, pieces of a conversation that didn't quite align the way they should. 10 minutes passed, then 15. The rhythm of the dinner resumed, laughter returning, deals inching closer to agreement. To everyone else, the moment had already disappeared, filed away as nothing more than a brief display of control. But Naomi hadn't forgotten. Because sometimes, the most important moments aren't the loud ones. They're the ones people assume don't matter. And as Ethan leaned back in his chair, confident, composed, completely certain the room still belonged to him, he had no idea that in just a few seconds, a single sentence from the one person he dismissed would take everything he thought he controlled and bring it to a complete and absolute stop. The sentence did not come out loud, not at first. It arrived measured, calm, almost too controlled for the tension it carried. The FDA compliance review you mentioned earlier has not cleared yet, has it? And for a fraction of a second, it sounded less like a challenge and more like a simple observation, the kind that could be dismissed if it came from anyone else. But it did not disappear. It stayed in the air, precise, undeniable. And that was the moment everything shifted, because Ethan Caldwell did not turn immediately. He paused, just long enough for the silence to stretch, just long enough for the investors at the table to process what they had just heard. And when he finally looked at Naomi Brooks, it was not with anger, not yet. It was with something far more dangerous, recognition. The sudden awareness that someone he had already dismissed had just stepped directly into the structure of his control. And across the table, the man from Texas leaned back slightly, his fingers no longer tapping the glass, his attention now fixed entirely on Ethan, waiting, not interrupting, but no longer passive, because the question had done something no presentation slide could do. It had introduced doubt, and doubt, in a room built on confidence, spreads faster than certainty. Ethan adjusted his posture, subtle, controlled, the kind of movement designed to signal that nothing had changed. That process is on schedule, he replied smoothly, his voice even, practiced, but the words landed differently now, not because they were weak, but because they were no longer unquestioned. And Naomi did not move, did not retreat. She remained exactly where she stood, tray balanced in one hand, gaze steady, not confrontational, just present, and presence, in that moment, was enough, because earlier, she continued, her tone unchanged, respectful, but clear. You mentioned a 90-day delay due to documentation review, and this time, the silence did not hesitate. It locked into place, heavier, sharper, because now it was not just a question, it was a contradiction, and contradictions do not disappear when spoken in the right room. They expand. The investor on Ethan's right exchanged a glance with his colleague, brief, silent, but loaded with implication, while another guest at the far end of the table slowly set his glass down. The soft click against the table louder than it should have been. Ethan's jaw tightened, not visibly to most, but enough for Naomi to see it. Enough to confirm what she already understood. The control he carried was real, but it was not unbreakable, not when the foundation beneath it was no longer stable. I think there has been a misunderstanding, Ethan said, his voice still calm, but now carrying a sharper edge, the kind that attempts to close a door before anyone else can step through it. But the door had already opened, because the man from Texas spoke next, not loudly, not aggressively, but with the quiet authority of someone who had just decided to look closer. 90 days is not a small delay, he said, his eyes fixed on Ethan, not Naomi, because the power in the room had not shifted completely. Not yet, but it was moving, and everyone could feel it. Ethan leaned forward slightly, hands clasped, posture perfect, the image of control he had built over years refusing to crack under pressure. All regulatory processes have variables, he replied, measured, controlled, but now every word carried weight, because every word was being evaluated, not accepted. And Naomi stepped back half a step, not retreating, but allowing the conversation to expand without her, because she understood something crucial. She did not need to dominate the room. She only needed to change its direction, and that had already happened. The investors were no longer listening to be impressed. They were listening to verify, to question, to reassess, and Ethan, for the first time that night, was no longer the only one controlling the narrative. The skyline outside continued to glow, unchanged, the city indifferent to what was unfolding 30 floors above it. But inside that room, something irreversible had begun, not loud, not dramatic, but precise, like a single thread being pulled from a perfectly tailored suit. And Naomi, standing just at the edge of it all, knew that the sentence she chose to speak was not powerful because it was loud. It was powerful because it was true, and truth, once spoken at the right moment, does not need permission to take over the room. The air in the room did not return to normal. It shifted into something tighter, more deliberate, like every word now carried weight it did not have 10 minutes ago, and Ethan Caldwell felt it, even if he refused to show it, because control was not just something he exercised, it was something he embodied, the kind of presence that had carried him through boardrooms, negotiations, and moments far more volatile than this. But there was a difference now, Subtle yet undeniable. The room was no longer following him. It was watching him. And there is a difference between being followed and being observed. One gives power, the other tests it. The investor from Texas leaned forward again, slower this time. His tone still calm, but no longer passive. We based our timeline on a clean regulatory path, he said, not accusing, not confrontational, but precise. The kind of precision that forces clarity whether you are ready for it or not. And Ethan nodded once, controlled, measured, his mind. Already recalibrating, adjusting the narrative, searching for the angle that would restore balance without conceding ground. And that remains the expectation, he replied, his voice steady. But now every syllable was being weighed, not just heard. And across the table another investor, a woman in her early 40s with a reputation for walking away from deals that felt even slightly misaligned, set her glass down and spoke for the first time that evening. Expectation and confirmation are not the same, she said, her gaze fixed on Ethan, not Naomi, because Naomi had already done what she needed to do. She had shifted the axis of the conversation, and now the room was rotating on its own, and Ethan could feel it. The edges of his certainty no longer as sharp as they were when the night began, because confidence thrives in agreement, but it weakens under scrutiny, and scrutiny had just entered the room without asking permission. Naomi stood just beyond the immediate circle, her posture unchanged, her expression calm. But her presence now carried a different weight, not because she had raised her voice, but because she had changed the direction of power without ever claiming it. And that is the kind of shift people do not forget, even if they pretend it did not happen. Ethan leaned back slightly, creating space, not retreating, but repositioning, his fingers resting lightly on the edge of the table as he considered his next move, because this was no longer about presenting a vision, it was about protecting it. And protection requires precision. All documentation is in progress, he said, choosing his words carefully. And we have full confidence in the outcome. But confidence, once questioned, does not land the same way. And the room reflected that. The Texas investor exchanged another glance with his colleagues, longer this time, less subtle, while the woman across from Ethan simply nodded once, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement that the conversation had changed. And somewhere near the back of the room, a quiet shift occurred as one of the junior associates discreetly pulled out a phone, not to interrupt, not to record openly, but to take notes, because moments like this do not announce themselves, they unfold quietly, and those who recognize them understand their significance. Immediately, Ethan noticed that too. Of course he did. He noticed everything, but noticing is not the same as controlling. And for the first time that evening, he was no longer setting the pace, he was responding to it, adapting in real time to a narrative that was no longer entirely his. And that realization, no matter how small, carries weight, because it means the room is no longer yours. It belongs to whoever holds the truth everyone else is trying to understand. Naomi turned slightly, stepping back into motion, picking up an empty glass from a nearby table, her movements smooth, unhurried, as if nothing extraordinary had happened. And that was the final shift, because power does not always announce itself with dominance. Sometimes it reveals itself through restraint, through the ability to step forward, change everything, and then step back without needing recognition. And as the conversation at the table continued, more cautious now, more precise, the skyline outside remained unchanged, the city still glowing, still moving, unaware that 30 floors above it, a single sentence had redrawn the balance of an entire room, and the man who believed he owned that room was now facing something far more difficult than opposition. He was facing doubt, and doubt, once introduced, does not leave quietly. The rhythm of the room never fully recovered. It adapted, slower now, more deliberate, like every word had to pass through a filter before it was allowed to exist, and Ethan Caldwell understood that better than anyone. Because this was the environment he had mastered for years, the subtle shifts, the unspoken signals, the way a single doubt could ripple through a deal and reshape it without anyone ever raising their voice. But tonight the shift had not come from a competitor, not from an investor, not from someone with leverage or status. It had come from someone he had already dismissed, and that made it harder to contain, not because it was louder, but because it was unexpected, and unexpected truths are the ones that linger. The woman across the table leaned forward again, her tone still calm, but now carrying a quiet finality. "We need clarity before we move forward," she said. Not as a suggestion, not as a negotiation tactic, but as a condition, and conditions change everything, because they remove assumption and replace it with requirement. And Ethan nodded once, controlled, measured, but inside, his calculations had shifted entirely. This was no longer about presenting strength. It was about preserving credibility, and credibility, once questioned, does not return easily. It has to be rebuilt, word by word, detail by detail. And every second of silence in that room was now working against him. Because silence, when filled with doubt, becomes pressure, and pressure reveals what confidence tries to hide. "We can provide updated documentation within the week," he said, adjusting the timeline, recalibrating the expectation, offering something tangible, something that could stabilize the conversation. But the adjustment itself was the confirmation, subtle, indirect, but clear enough for everyone at the table to recognize. The timeline was no longer what it had been presented as earlier, and that recognition did not need to be spoken. It moved through the room quietly, in exchanged glances, in slight shifts of posture, in the way people began to happening inside one of them. And Naomi, standing just beyond the center of it all, allowed herself one brief moment of stillness, not to celebrate, not to reflect, but to acknowledge what had just occurred, not a victory, not a defeat, but a correction, a moment where reality had reasserted itself over assumption, where a single sentence had done what hours of presentation could not. It had forced the truth into the open, and in doing so, it had reminded everyone in that room of something they rarely consider until it is too late, that the person you choose to ignore may be the one who sees everything most clearly. And as the conversation shifted into logistics, into next steps, into cautious reassessment, the balance of the room remained altered, not dramatically, not visibly to the outside world, but permanently for those who had been there to witness it. Because once you see where power actually comes from, you cannot pretend it comes from anywhere else. The conversation did not collapse. It reformed, slower, more careful, like a structure that had just been tested and found to be less stable than it appeared, and Ethan Caldwell adjusted with it. Because adaptation was not weakness, it was survival at the level he operated. But even adaptation has limits when the foundation has been questioned, and tonight that foundation had shifted in a way he could not fully control. The investors no longer leaned in with anticipation, they listened with evaluation, each response measured against what had already been revealed, each answer weighed not just for its confidence, but for its consistency, and consistency, once broken, is difficult to restore in real time. Ethan's team exchanged brief, controlled glances, the kind that say everything without saying anything, recalculating, preparing, but also recognizing that the narrative they arrived with was no longer the one guiding the room. And near the service station, Naomi Brooks stood, quietly, her hands resting lightly against the polished surface, her breathing steady, her presence once again blending into the background. But the room had changed in a way that made true invisibility impossible, because once someone has shifted the balance of power, even subtly, people remember, even if they do not acknowledge it openly. One of the junior associates approached her, hesitant, respectful, his voice low. "Did you catch that earlier?" he asked, not as a challenge, but as someone trying to understand how she saw what others missed. And Naomi simply nodded once, not elaborating, not stepping into a role she had not asked for, because this was not about proving anything. It was about recognizing what was already there. And across the room, the conversation continued to tighten, timelines adjusted, conditions clarified, language becoming more precise, more cautious, until finally the Texas investor set his glass down again, this time with intention. "We are going to pause final commitments until we review the updated documentation," he said, his tone steady, final. And that was the moment the deal changed shape entirely. Not canceled, not lost, but no longer controlled by a single voice, no longer driven by momentum alone. And Ethan nodded, because there was no other move available that preserved what remained of the situation. "That is reasonable," he replied, his voice still composed, but now carrying something new, not doubt exactly, but awareness, the kind that comes when control is no longer absolute. The skyline outside remained constant, lights flickering across the glass. The city moving forward without hesitation, unaware of the quiet recalibration happening above it, and Naomi picked up her tray again, stepping back into motion, refilling a glass here, clearing a plate there, her actions seamless, practiced, but her understanding of the room now deeper than it had been when the night began, because she had seen the shift from assumption to scrutiny, from dominance to negotiation, and she understood something that many people spend years learning: that power is not something you hold. It is something others allow you to keep, and the moment they begin to question it, everything changes. Ethan stood a few minutes later, signaling the transition of the evening, not abrupt, not forced, but controlled in the only way it could be now, through composure rather than command. And as the guests began to rise, conversations softening into smaller exchanges, quieter reflections, the weight of what had happened settled into the space between them, not spoken, but understood. The woman who had questioned him earlier passed by Naomi briefly, her eyes meeting hers for just a second, a subtle acknowledgement, not dramatic, not performative, but real, and Naomi returned the look with the same calm she had carried all night. Because recognition did not change who she was, it simply confirmed what she already knew, that dignity does not require permission, and truth does not need status to be heard. And as Ethan made his way toward the exit, his posture still straight, his presence still commanding, he paused for just a moment, not long enough for others to notice, but long enough to glance in Naomi's direction, not with anger, not with dismissal, but with something far more complex, something closer to understanding, because for the first time that evening, he had seen the room from a perspective he had not considered before, and that perspective had changed everything. The room did not empty all at once. It dissolved slowly, like tension releasing in layers, conversations breaking into smaller pieces, voices lowering, footsteps soft against polished floors as the evening shifted from negotiation to quiet reflection, and Ethan Caldwell moved through it with the same composed precision he had carried all night, acknowledging investors with brief nods, controlled smiles, measured words that revealed nothing more than what he intended. But beneath that composure, something had changed, not visibly, not in a way most would notice, but in the way his attention no longer moved past certain details as easily as it had before, because once a blind spot is exposed, it does not return to darkness. It stays, sharp and present, demanding to be accounted for. And as he reached the edge of the room, just before the exit where the city lights framed the glass doors like a silent audience, he stopped, not abruptly, not enough to draw attention, but enough to make a decision, and then he turned, not back toward the investors, not toward his team, but toward Naomi Brooks, who was now clearing the final table near the far side of the room, her movements unchanged, her focus steady, as if the night had followed the same pattern as any other, because in her world, it often did. Moments of tension, moments of being overlooked, moments of stepping forward and then returning to the background without expectation of recognition. But this moment did not pass unnoticed, not by him. And when Ethan approached, the distance between them closed quietly, without urgency, without spectacle, just two people standing in the same space for the first time, without the structure of roles defining the interaction. Naomi looked up as he stopped a few feet away, her posture straight, her expression calm, not guarded, not confrontational, simply present, and for a second, neither of them spoke, because sometimes the weight of what has already been said makes additional words unnecessary. But Ethan did not leave it there. "You heard everything," he said finally, his voice lower now, stripped of the projection it carried earlier, not a question, not an accusation, but a recognition, and Naomi met his gaze without hesitation. "I listened," she replied, her tone even, not defensive, not apologetic, because she had nothing to defend and nothing to apologize for. And that was the difference, one that Ethan understood immediately, because in his world, people often spoke to gain something, to position themselves, to influence outcomes. But what she had done was different. She had not inserted herself for advantage. She had spoken because the truth required it, and that distinction carries weight. "You changed the direction of the entire deal," he said, not with frustration, but with clarity, as if stating a fact he had already accepted, and Naomi shook her head slightly, not dismissing his words, but refining them. "No," she said quietly. "I did not change it. I just said what was already there." And that answer did something Ethan had not expected. It removed the sense of confrontation entirely and replaced it with something more difficult to argue with. Because if she was right, then the issue had never been her interruption. It had been the assumption that the truth would go unnoticed, and for a moment, the distance between who he believed he was in that room and what had actually happened narrowed into something he could not ignore. The city outside continued to move, lights shifting, traffic flowing, life unchanged. But inside that space, something quieter had taken place, something that does not make headlines or announcements, but alters perspective in a way that lasts far longer than the moment itself. Ethan exhaled slowly, not out of frustration, but out of acknowledgement, the kind that comes when control is no longer the only measure of strength. "You could have stayed silent," he said, not as a criticism, but as an observation, and Naomi gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "I could have," she replied, and then after a brief pause, she added, "But silence does not fix anything." And that was it. No speech, no explanation, just a simple statement that carried more weight than anything else said that night. Because it was not about the deal, or the money, or the room. It was about something more fundamental, something that does not change based on status or setting, and Ethan understood that, even if he did not say it out loud, because for the first time that evening, the person he had dismissed had become the one he could not ignore, not because she demanded attention, but because she had earned it without ever asking for it. For a second before returning to her work, collecting the last of the glasses, aligning the table settings, restoring the room to the pristine order it held before the night began, because for her, the job did not end with the moment, it continued through it, beyond it, grounded in the same discipline that had carried her through countless shifts, countless nights where she had been overlooked, underestimated, or simply unseen. But tonight had been different, not because she had spoken, but because she had chosen when to speak, and timing, as Ethan himself had said earlier, is everything. In the far corner of the room, two investors lingered in quiet conversation, their voices low but focused, no longer discussing projections or market share, but risk, structure, verification, the kind of language that replaces excitement once doubt has entered the equation. And near the exit, one of Ethan's senior advisors spoke into his phone, already adjusting schedules, preparing documents, shifting timelines, because the consequences of a moment like this do not wait. They begin immediately, unfolding in emails, calls, decisions that ripple outward long after the room has emptied. And yet, for all the movement, all the recalibration, the most significant change remained invisible, carried not in documents or deals, but in perspective, because every person who had been in that room had witnessed something they could not easily dismiss, the moment when authority was questioned not with volume, but with accuracy, when control met truth and had to adjust, not collapse, not fail, but adapt. And that distinction matters, because it is not about taking power away, it is about redefining where it comes from. Naomi placed the final glass onto her tray and paused for just a second, not out of fatigue, not out of reflection, but out of awareness, because she understood something deeply simple and deeply rare, that moments like this do not need to be repeated to have impact. They do their work once, clearly, and then they remain, shaping how people think, how they listen, how they speak the next time they are in a room where assumptions try to take the place of understanding. And as she turned toward the service corridor, the golden light of the dining room fading behind her, replaced by the quieter, cooler tones of the staff area. The contrast was almost symbolic, two worlds existing side by side, one defined by visibility and influence, the other by effort and endurance. And yet tonight, for a brief moment, those worlds had intersected in a way that neither could ignore. Ethan stepped out into the elevator lobby, the city stretching out before him through the glass. Endless, moving, indifferent, and he stopped again, just for a second, not to look back, but to stand still within the realization that something small had altered something significant, not the deal alone, not the numbers, but the way he would hear the next voice that spoke from a place he had once overlooked. Because once you recognize that truth does not belong to status, You cannot return to believing that it ever did. And as the elevator doors opened and he stepped inside, the reflection of the city lights shifting across the mirrored walls, the night continued forward, unchanged to the outside world, but permanently different for those who had been there to witness the moment when one voice, measured and precise, had reminded an entire room that power is not defined by who controls the conversation, but by who understands it most clearly. Morning did not arrive with drama. It came quietly, as it always does, sunlight stretching across the glass towers of Manhattan, catching the edges of buildings that had witnessed countless deals, countless conversations, countless moments that felt important in the night and became something else by daylight. And inside a corner office high above the city, Ethan Caldwell stood near the window, looking out not as a man surveying what he owned, but as someone reconsidering what control actually meant, because the numbers were still there, the contracts still pending, the influence still intact, but something in the way he processed it all had shifted, not weakened, not diminished, but refined, and on his desk lay the revised documentation his team had worked through overnight, every detail double-checked, every timeline clarified, every assumption replaced with confirmation, because the cost of being precise had just become far more valuable than the comfort of being certain. And across the city, in a smaller apartment where the morning light came through a single window, Naomi Brooks tied her hair back the same way she always did, preparing for another shift, another day, another set of tables that would not remember her name, and she did not expect them to, because expectation had never been the foundation of her strength. Discipline had, consistency had, the quiet decision to show up fully even when no one noticed, and last night had not changed that. It had only confirmed something she already knew, that being overlooked does not mean being unaware, and that awareness, when used with intention, carries its own kind of power. The restaurant would open again in a few hours, the same polished floors, the same carefully arranged tables, the same atmosphere designed to make everything feel effortless, and for most people who walked in, it would be just another place, another experience, another night they would forget. But for a few, for those who had been there, the space would never feel exactly the same, because they had seen what happens when a single voice, calm and precise, interrupts the illusion that power is absolute. And later that afternoon, an email moved quietly through a network of executives and investors, not dramatic, not urgent, but significant, a revised proposal, adjusted terms, a slower timeline, more cautious, more grounded, and attached to it. A note from Ethan, brief, direct, without unnecessary language. Clarity ensures strength. And for those who read it, the message was clear, not just about the deal, but about the shift behind it. Because leadership is not defined by avoiding correction, it is defined by how you respond when correction becomes unavoidable. And back at the restaurant, as the first guests of the evening began to arrive, Naomi moved through the room once again, her steps quiet, her presence steady, the same as before, and yet not entirely the same, because something had been seen, something had been acknowledged, even if not spoken out loud, and that acknowledgement does not need repetition to exist. It remains subtle, quiet, shaping the way a room feels even when no one can explain why. And near the end of her shift, as she passed by the same table where everything had unfolded the night before, she paused for just a second, not to relive it, not to hold on to it, but to recognize it for what it was, a moment, brief, precise, complete, and then she moved on. Because that is what real strength does. It does not linger in recognition. It continues forward, unchanged in purpose, grounded in something deeper than attention. And somewhere across the city, in another room, another meeting, another conversation, Ethan listened differently than he had before, not louder, not more dominant, but more aware, because once you understand that the truth can come from anywhere, you stop deciding in advance who is worth hearing, and that shift, quiet as it was, carried more power than anything he had said the night before, because in the end, it was never about who owned the room. It was about who understood it, and that understanding does not belong to status. It belongs to those who are willing to see what others overlook, speak when it matters, and then walk away without needing the room to remember their name.